Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a lovely day. I have a special guest with me, Samuel Barnes, author of the Iconoclast and Anti-Philosophy, which was an absolutely beautiful book that I read. If I could describe it in one little bit, it would be it's kind of like if you saw an ocean full of sharks and you jumped into the ocean and the people on land looked down at you and they're like, why are you in this ocean swimming with the sharks? Why aren't you on land? And you're down there with the sharks and the sharks are like, hey, how's it going? We'll swim you back to shore, like no matter where that is. We'll find it together. And that's how I would describe this book. It was really a beautiful piece of work, and I would love to talk to you about it today. And I'm really interested in your journey that caused you to write this book.
That is the weirdest review I've ever had, and I say that in like a positive way. I say that in a completely positive way.
I feel like I have to explain it in a very roundabout way, to kind of uh, go along the lines of what the book talks about.
Well,
I
no,
felt like I had to
it's
do a
perfectly apt. I mean, one of the points of the book, seeing as it's an attempt to answer the question, what is philosophy, and kind of hence what is the limits of human cognition and these sorts of things. Like very often you do end up getting to a place where you can only kind of reach out to metaphor and poetics to really describe what you mean by something.
yes,
Like
absolutely.
you could have just said, "Oh, this book made me feel very confused and very disoriented, and made me feel like I was jumping into some dangerous truths that I didn't want to know." But I think the shark infested waters analogy is much more
Yeah,
easy to understand. I think, frankly, which is
I
strange
will
because it sounds like it shouldn't be, but it is.
I will confess though, I did grab this book about a year ago and I started reading it, and I very much wasn't ready to read it because I was very heavily into like studying being and time and
Right.
Heidegger, and I was very much like I have to learn the terms and I have to do this perfectly and I have to reason perfectly. And so I picked up the book and I was like, this is not for me." And then I went through my own kind of iconoclastic transformation and I picked the book up like a month or two ago and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
this makes sense now.
That's another point of the book is it's not for everyone, and it's definitely
Mhm.
not for everyone at all times.
Yeah.
One of the big points about the book is there are the two modes of thinking, right? So there's the iconoclastic mode of thinking, which is the pure philosophical, pure challenging and destructive intellectual thought force, and then there is the dogmatic extropic force, which wants to collect things and categorize things and make things make sense, right? And sometimes it's correct to think in a dogmatic way, and sometimes it's correct to think in an iconoclastic way, and I think yeah, you kind of have to be in the mood. You have to be ready for a bit of destruction and confusion to really understand the book, I think.
So for you, I'm really interested to know what kind of put you into the mood to explore
Mhm.
um this iconoclastic way of thinking.
Yeah, yeah. So my way into philosophy is a bit of a weird one because I was working in a you know very white collar job in London at the time, straight out of university. Had like followed the path to do well for myself and all that sort of good stuff. But I was like, oh, something's missing. What's missing? I don't know what's missing. And I was like, I need something to. I need an avenue for my like energy, my intellectual energy. I
Yeah.
need to do something with it. So I went to an open evening at University of London, and I was thinking, oh, I like history. I'm probably going to do history. And a pretty boring conversation with the person who was like representing the history department there. And I was just walking around like the humanities section, if you will. I didn't really want to do more computer science or mathematics or anything like that. So I was pretty set on humanities. And I can barely even understand, I can barely remember the content of the conversation, but I remember having a very confusing conversation with someone from the philosophy department and thinking, that sounds really difficult and I'd like to try that. So I was doing that part-time. That's kind of my way into philosophy as such, because I'd never, this is me in like early 20s, so lots of people read something and understand it a bit earlier on, but this was the first time I really understood stuff. Then I sort of started to realize that, this is mostly because of time and stuff, and the fact that education's quite watered down these days, I think, in the modern world. But if you do a philosophy degree of any sort, unless you're doing a PhD, you tend to just do sections of books as opposed to actually deeply studying philosophers. So I realized this, and I started incorporating some very strange my writing style, which I think you'll kind of agree is pretty distinct and comes out in this book and comes out in my previous book. And I think the best way to describe it is it's more conversational. It's definitely influenced by the way Nick Land writes, because he was the first philosopher that I read, and I was like, wow, philosophy can be not just signposted, dull, uninteresting, sorry, studies of things. It can actually be poetic and strange and confusing and kind of disturbing and disgusting in a way. So I started doing that, which basically for that master's didn't get me a great grade, but it helped me develop a unique writing style. So I started writing off the back of that, which led into Missing Axioms and led to the Iconoclast. But what really led to the Iconoclast specifically, and the ideas in it, and the answering the question of what is philosophy and whether this is why it's called an anti-philosophy, is one of the main points of the book. Is it's not entirely clear that we should do philosophy, like that it's a positive for human flourishing or contentment or anything like this. And these are ideas that were really tackled by David Hume. And they were tackled by David Hume in the texts which aren't usually put on university syllabuses. On university syllabuses, you get his cause and effect stuff, like slices of that book, and you get slices of the ethics and religion books, basically, that are pretty well-known stuff. But if you read the books in their entirety, and especially if you understand the subtext of what he's saying, I would say Hume's main project is what is philosophy, and whether it's a good or a bad thing for the human subject. Basically, I would say that is actually his main project. I would say whether he even realized it or not, I don't know. But that's the subtext of his books, and I realized that there is also an ancient skepticism. So this is primarily from Philo, and these are texts which haven't had much scholarship for the last 40 or so years. So I decided to incorporate that as well. So yeah, that was the main way into this as a specific topic, was going back to what was piecemeal covered during a university course and actually having a deep study of Hume and Thoreau specifically.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's absolutely great. I can't even, I don't know if I could actually pinpoint an exact moment where I was like, maybe this dogmatic way of thinking and reasoning is not exactly the way we should be doing things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a series of little moments, kind of like glimpses. And actually, I would love to read just like a little paragraph of my favorite part of the book, which was chapter 8, Extravagant Philosophy. Um, it says, the intellect of the iconoclast transgresses the faulty appearances as they are experienced by humanity, going beyond the human concept of a containerized world of the appearances. This occurs not by force of any autonomy or reflective reason. The heroic exploits of sincere philosophy are enacted in a hapless moment of iconoclastic impulse. And you use the word impulse, and it made me think of how I use the word glimpse. It's like
Yeah. Uh-huh.
you you can't really reason. You're put in a moment where you see something and you don't exactly know what you're seeing, but it changes you.
Yeah.
And so that I had to share that because that was my absolute favorite part of the book.
very well read as well. I'm doing the audiobook now for my YouTube channel, and I'm realizing how I definitely got this from reading too much continental philosophy, but it's not easy to read, man. And I'm, writing it. I'm like, because it's my own writing. I'm like, oh, this is really easy to understand, but it's really not easy to understand, and it's really not easy to read. And yeah, like you said, unfortunately, it's got a lot of philosophical language prerequisites. But yeah, that chapter, extravagant philosophy, that definitely is kind of like the pro philosophy part of the book. And I think this is another thing I realized doing. This is definitely part of my like elitist thinking, but this is something I realized doing philosophy at a university level is a lot of people do it, and there's a lot of mature students like I was doing these courses, and they sort of do it as a hobby or like a bit of fun. And like real philosophy actually like challenge, or if it's done properly, it should like really challenge you existentially. If you're not having crises and you're not having flourishes, like you said, glimpses of uh meaning, like positive, if you've not got the equal duopoly of like positive and negative emotion, extreme positive and
Mm-hmm.
negative emotion from philosophy, then you're basically not doing it right. And it's a possibility that lots of those sorts of people actually aren't capable of doing it, which is that's kind of the anti-philosophical side. But if you're blessed enough to be able to have those glimpses into um both the positive and negative sides of it, I think that's a blessing, that's a wonderful thing, but also a terrible thing, because it
Yeah.
does because it's one of those things where you realize how dogmatic you are in everyday life.
Mhm.
You realize, especially if you're part, and I was at the time like part of part of the spreadsheet economy, part of his office stuff with meetings where nothing is really said or planned, and 10% of people are doing 90% of the work, and most people are just moving spreadsheets, moving files around and stuff, and there's not really any work going on. And you realize you have these moments, and like you said, glimpses is a perfect word to use for it. You have these glimpses, and you realize how much of everything is. Is this a family channel? I don't know. I was going to say bullshit, but there we go.
Mhm. And I think what's beautiful about it is that it's completely out of thin air. It just you don't ever plan for it. They just happen to you.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
you don't choose the day of the week to have your existential crisis on. It's not in your calendar. Like you don't book it in time. Like, oh, sorry guys, I'm not gonna be working 100% today. I'm gonna be having my existential crisis.
Yeah, I love going back and reading things over again. It's like Schopenhauer when I read his essay on women. I was
Yes.
super angry the first time I read it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then when I went back and read it again, I was like, well, maybe, he is saying something of substance here. And like Nietzsche, the video I just did on that, uh, when he was talking about man versus
Yeah.
woman, I was like, oh, well, what if we look at it as feminine versus masculine? And then it becomes a completely different thing. And I love that you brought up Nietzsche in your work because he is very poetic and kind of has a roundabout way of saying things. And I don't, this is just my guess, but I wonder if he never really meant for people to take him literally. And he wanted them to go into that sort of, he, I mean, he didn't use the word iconoclastic, but that sort of thinking where you're breaking down the structure and going beyond
Yeah.
what you see in front of you.
This is what he says at the end of Zarathustra, is that, he doesn't want people to follow him.
Hmm.
And like, Zarathustra telling all the other people to go their own way is almost like, because the iconoclast doesn't follow anyone, like they go their own way, so it is a very similar message. One thing I think is unique to literature and philosophy is that you can have that subtext.
Hmm.
And one thing that I would suggest to people, if they are kind of in this mode when they're reading philosophy, like I was in this mode for a while, like you're like, oh, I have to read Nietzsche, so I'm going to read all of Nietzsche. Tick, I've read all of Nietzsche. Now I'm going to read Hume. I've read all of Hume. Tick, and all this sort of thing. And on the first reading of Hume, you're like, oh, this guy, he's a kind of like the first atheist, and he's got all these materialist views, and he's talking about cause and effect, skepticism, all that good stuff. but then you have that second reading, like you were talking about, like when you go back to Nietzsche again, and you realize there is a subtext, whether it's intended or not, and it gives you it gives you a whole new level to these things. And I think that's really beautiful, I think. But yeah, we had a great conversation on Schopenhauer, especially his On Women essay, which you listen to it first time, or you read it the first time, and you're like, this is some sort of anti-woman tract or something. But then you read it again, and it's kind of like with Nietzsche's kind of like overt sexist statements.
Hmm.
And you realize he's almost a lot of them, especially, I almost feel like this is definitely using an anachronistic term, but I think he kind of saw his own inceldom. And I think like a lot of it, if you can kind of see a world where he's pointing fun at, like making fun of himself for his inceldom
Hmm.
almost. Maybe that's too charitable, but that's how I read him these days anyway. So
Yeah, and I I personally, well, I know that Schopenhauer had a bit of problems with women, but I don't know if Nietzsche did, and I I feel like looking at it in a way that is more poetic helps us to not necessarily bring the emotion out of it, but to find new avenues and new ways of thinking that can help us in the future. Um, and like this is also how I feel about religion too, because I know we touched on this a little bit in our voice recordings, but so I kind of went through a transformation myself where I started to break down religion and but I didn't necessarily leave religion. On Saturdays, I go to synagogue, and on Sundays, I go to Catholic Mass. And then I also follow like some Buddhist practices.
yeah.
And it's funny because I've actually gotten a very like positive response from people when I tell people that I'm doing that. They're like, "Oh, that's really cool that you do all of those things." And I don't know, I feel like it's almost like I left religion and I came back to it, but in a very iconoclastic structure where I broke it down and then um I'm building it again for
Yeah.
myself.
Mhm.
And because I know you said you kind of did something a little similar to that.
Yeah.
Um and I would love to hear like your story on that if you don't mind talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of British people, like I wouldn't say lots of British, they are like in the census they're like atheists, right? But they're not like explicitly like Dawkins kind of atheists, they're just kind
Mhm.
of benign atheists, I think. Like, I mean, English people especially are benign about pretty much everything, which
Mhm.
is not one of the negative things about English people, I'd say. Um, but one thing I did realize, and I think this is true of many, like most European peoples, is you're culturally Christian and you can't really escape that
Mhm.
container, even if you want to. Um, so I attend church semi regularly, but I also attend um, Buddhist services and meditation groups and stuff like this. So, and then like you said, you can view that sort of praxis as very iconoclastic and almost postmodern in the fact that you're just picking and choosing what you like from all these different things. But what's very interesting, and this is something I talk about in the book, is that tension between iconoclasm and dogmatism, which I think every human in their lived life does in some way,
Mhm.
because you know everyone ends up in dogmatic structures, right? Whether that's a bad relationship or a bad work environment or something like this, and
Mhm.
to break out of that dogmatism of, oh, I have to serve my boss and whatever, you have to get iconoclastic and say, fuck it, I'm quitting this job, or fuck it, I'm leaving this abusive person, and um, one thing that's very interesting, and I'm wondering if you have had a similar experience, is you know being iconoclastic in the sense that, oh, I can get some worth from meditation. Oh, I feel something in the Christian service. I feel a very certain way about the Gospels, whether that's an ethnic thing or a cultural thing. I have no idea to what degree that is. But then what you do is you realize the similarities between these things, and you realize that prayer is another sort of meditation. And okay, maybe there's definitely some difference in the telos of these things. I mean, if you're going to get really literal about it, like Christianity is about judgment, and it is about us going in one direction towards the final point of revelation and judgment. And Buddhism is very much a deism that is trying to aim at, again, what Schopenhauer was talking about in terms of trying to detach from these desires, the earthly will, and these sorts of things. But all the practical similarities are there, and in fact, even the physical similarities are there. So I'll show you something I have here, right? So this is my rosary, very old rosary, right? It's so old that I'm actually missing a bead from it, so I have to pretend there's a bead on one side. So that's shows you. I mean, maybe don't seem like the most pious person in the world, but I've broken a bead on a rosary because I've prayed so much. So there you go, that's one for me. And then these are some Buddhist prayer beads. So I mean, I'm sorry to be so like stark and obvious about it, but through iconoclasm, you can very often through that destruction, through that entropy, you can recollect things in extropy. You can recollect something that's meaningful for you, something that works for you. And it sounds like you're doing a very similar thing. Like you've gone through that iconoclastic mode, which is maybe an atheism, and then realizing that certain parts of certain things work for you, and then like you said, you're recollecting your own practice. You're creating a new dogmatism, which is
Mhm.
something I talk about in the book. I hope that makes sense. But
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I remember going through my own sort of glimpse where I was just kind of sitting in church and I was like, oh my goodness, like everybody, even the atheists, are all just kind of trying to figure it out.
yeah, sure, yeah,
Like whatever it is, they're just trying to figure something out. And and that to me was just like the most beautiful thing ever. And it was like for that moment, I kind of saw the differences dissipate. And 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 I know like so for synagogue, it's very much like it's very structured. It's kind
yeah.
of it's more rooted in the physical where they see the Torah and they're like, you follow the Torah. And then
And it being a legalistic way of seeing the world as well. It's probably like the dogmatic religion par
yes.
excellence almost, you know.
And then like Buddhism, I think of as very metaphysical in nature. And then um Catholicism, I because there's a sort of mystery to Catholicism. And I
Definitely.
feel like that's kind of like the middle part where it's like the physical and the metaphysical together. And so those three I've kind of found like it's almost like a movable structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And yeah, this is the truth of humanity. And you were saying, you know, people trying to work things out. That's the story of humanity, you know, like Luther nailing his thesis to the church. That is him trying to work things out. Like
Hmm.
it's very interesting because you know Protestantism, especially in certain forms, is very dogmatic. But Luther is an agent of iconoclasm, which
Hmm.
is very interesting, and it's a response. It's a moving response to that dogmatism of the Catholic Church, basically. Um, and so, like I said, there are epochs of dogmatism, there are epochs of iconoclasm, and there is a time to be iconoclastic. There's a time to be dogmatic, and yeah, certain figures appear, certain figures of dogmatism and certain figures of iconoclasm appear throughout history. It seems, in my conception, anyway.
Hmm. And I also feel that doing this kind of um, destruction and then coming back to religion, it's almost helped me to be a little to I because I know in the book you talk about suspending judgment.
Yeah,
And there will be times where I'm sitting in church or synagogue and I'm like, I don't really agree with that. But then through this practice of seeing the different religions, it's kind of helped me to be like, this is what they are trying to do to figure it out. And that in itself is beautiful, and that's
Yeah.
okay. And just because I don't necessarily agree with it, it's still good for them, and it's just wonderful to see everybody doing that. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so the idea of suspension of judgment that comes from Philo, who's one of the he's the original skeptic of antiquity. Basically, he's kind of like the ultimate skeptic. He has volumes and volumes where he just goes through every kind of concept. He's like, this is why time isn't real. This is why space isn't real. And I very selective with it in the book because it does. It's obviously super important to philosophy, and it's obviously like they're obviously great texts, but it is a little bit repetitive. He's like, this is why animals aren't real or something like this is why the natural world isn't real. Like it's the ultimate skepticism, and he has this idea of suspension of judgment because he thinks that that's ultimately where we are as humans. We can't really put our finger on something, so it's almost a enlightenment way of it's like sorry it's like enlightenment. I don't mean that in the Buddhist sense. It's almost like a calm way of being.
mhm,
He's trying to say the human aim, and this is very anti-philosophical. That's kind of where that idea comes from. Is from him. Is where he says the ideal place for us to be as thinking agents is in that suspense of judgment, where we're not casting aspersions one way or the other. And it's interesting because there's descriptions of Thoreau, which it's kind of in debate whether they're legit or not, whether they're made up later on. But he's described as a kind of drifter who's not really this way or that, and isn't doesn't seem to be bothered by anything around him and this sort of stuff. And
mhm,
I guess so that's his ideal. Now, whether you think that's actually an ideal to aspire to is a different question, because I think I would probably disagree with that. But it does show you the kind of limits of that philosophy. It shows you where the logical end of that philosophy is.
mhm,
Um, and I suppose that's kind of, maybe the iconoclast is that. He's just a wanderer that doesn't really get anywhere and doesn't really care about anything. And well, there you go. Look, we're already on the point where, well, okay, pure philosophizing and the iconoclast himself or herself, sorry, maybe that's a bad thing to be. Maybe it's just, because, you know, what is the person who never like casts judgment? What is the person that never casts judgment? Well, they're the person who sees evil and doesn't do anything about it. They're the
mhm,
person who sees good and doesn't try and assist the good. Like, so there's two ways that this goes, but then equally, the dogmatist can be a tyrant, but the dogmatist can also be a righteous dogmatist. So um it's a very interesting question, I think, and that's kind of yeah. I would urge people, if they're interested in those concepts, to go and read the book, because frankly, if you want to learn about Thoreau, I think that my book's actually an easy way in than reading his work and like actually reading his work. Frankly,
I didn't even know who he was before I read your book,
well,
so.
this is what I was saying. Like, no one's done any scholarship on him for like 40 years at least, and to find the materials on him, there's a very bad printing on Amazon you can get of the outlines of Thurenism, and there are some low ebb translations of the Greek, which have like kind of the Greek on one page and the English on the other. But yeah, you look everywhere, and these things aren't read. Like, they have no reviews online or anything like this, and you have to go and find a used bookshop and find a dusty old. I'm pretty sure actually the dusty old copy I found of these books, like, they'd never actually been opened before. Uh,
Mhm. Oh my goodness.
so that was
So
pretty.
they were really unread.
Well, and it was also, actually, to be frank with you, I think I mentioned this in a footnote somewhere, but it was vindicating my view that actual philosophy is very rarely done
Mhm,
and I mean that in a good and a bad sense. Like, in one sense you're saying, well, then no one cares and who cares, right? But then in another sense you're saying, well, this is for the very elite few. This is for very few people should be doing this sort of stuff. um, and the fact that someone had bought these books and never opened them is kind of vindicating that, I think. But yeah, they weren't cheap, and yeah, very difficult to find.
um, Going back to the dogmatist and the iconoclast, I feel like they are both equally important. And it's
Mhm.
almost like I'm going to use a little story here. It's almost like if you're at the mall and you've got the dogmatist and the iconoclast who are just walking hand in hand. And the iconoclast is like, "Oh my gosh, look at that pretty dress in the window. Let's go. And it drags the dogmatist into the store. And the iconoclast is like, let's look at everything. And the
Mm,
dogmatist is like, okay, let's look at, you can look, but let's pick a couple things because we can't buy the whole store.
yeah,
And so I think both are very much equally important. But I
yeah,
think right now we have like way more dogmatism than we do iconoclasm or
yeah.
kind of, I don't know if I said that right, but iconoclasts. And I wonder if there's a way we can. I do think that, especially with the kind of breaking down of religion, we're seeing more of that iconoclastic thinking,
Yeah.
but I it's really hard to break out of that duality. Like it has to be this or this, which is it is super important because I remember in my Nietzsche video I was saying how you have to have that dogmatic black and white thinking if you're, say, like building a house and
Yeah.
you're using brick instead of stucco because it's
Yeah.
based on the climate. Like you
Well, I
you
mean,
have
Iconoclast is
to
like,
think it.
what happens if we don't put foundations in? Let's see what happens.
Yeah, let's just see what happens. And the dogmatist is like, oh my gosh.
I liked your narrative way of putting it because the iconoclast is there and it's like almost closing time and he's like admiring every sequin on the dress, and the dogmatist is like, dude, we came here to get ice cream. Like, what are we
Yes.
doing in this dress shop? So it's one thing is that the iconoclast has that still has that wonder for the world and all the things around him, but he
Mhm.
never really gets anywhere, unfortunately.
Mhm.
The dogmatist unfortunately doesn't appreciate the little things, kind of. So you know, beyond just the big questions of living in a time of dogmatism and iconoclasm, it can kind of help you think. I don't know, like maybe where you're being a bit curt with a friend or a family member, and you realize that you maybe just have to slow down and appreciate that they don't want to go straight to the ice cream stand and they want to do something else. But I think you're overall correct in your assessment that we live in a dogmatic time. And I'm not, this is away from religion as well. This gets into stuff like politics and
Mhm.
that sort of stuff. But frankly, yeah, we live in a kind of hyper moral time. And I mean that we've kind of become hyper moral in our anti-moralism, if that makes sense. We live in like an iconoclastically dogmatic time, if that makes sense, I think.
Mhm.
So yeah, kind of like, you know, everyone's equal and that sort of stuff, but unspokenly, some people are given privileges and these sorts of stuff. But yeah, it's difficult to know what to employ in the present, but you just see it in the way, like with democracy and the way people vote. Like you can just see that people are calling out for um, something more dogmatic, and that's especially true in Europe, the way things are going.
Mhm.
And one thing that I think is an issue is that, and I talk about this a lot in the book, how you know, like a iconoclasm can be too free flowing, can be too permissive. And there's a reaction to that, which is, you know, the dogmatist tyrant, right? But there's
Mhm.
also a time when you know, you have the dogmatist tyrant and people are calling out for iconoclasm, and it ends up in things like the French Revolution, where everyone's, you know, such an iconoclastic time that we're just beheading people for fun or whatever. Um, so one thing it's very, I think it's a very, the book kind of proposes quite in that, in respect to politics and religion, proposes quite an anti-utopian outlook, because utopias are always either the extreme distillation of dogmatism or iconoclasm, right?
Mhm.
They're either too permissive or they're too tyrannical. And it sort of suggests a middle ground where instead of ignoring those that are calling out for a bit more order, you should incorporate that into the structure. Um, I don't know if that's going to be heeded. I think we're probably going to, the pendulum's going to swing pretty hard the other direction, I think, pretty soon, for better or for worse. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I suppose you might have a different perspective, seeing, yeah, you know, American. So I think there's slightly different things going on both sides of the pond right now. But I'm interested to get your perspective. Because I definitely always, my default is for viewing things from the European side of things, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I can definitely say every time I open up the news, I'm like, I gotta close it back down again.
Yeah,
Because well, it's just both sides are becoming so extreme, and they're like, because you've got one side all the way over here and the other side all the way over here, and they're like, it has to be like this.
mm,
And I'm like, well, you have to find ways to kind of like break out of that dogmatic thinking, because if you don't, then you're going to get um I forgot the word for it, but you're going to get what tyranny on either side, whichever side it goes.
yeah,
And so I think what America needs right now is the iconoclast who's like who goes in there with a bulldozer, and they're like, we're gonna start over and just get rid of everything, and
yeah,
then we're gonna build it back up again. And now I think this could be like a slippery slope when people hear about iconoclasm. I feel like a lot of people would accidentally fall into nihilism,
yeah,
because
exactly.
they'd be
Yeah,
like, "Oh, we're just destroying everything. We're
yeah,
just starting over." But I feel like, yes, you have to destroy it, but you have to collect it again
yeah,
and
exactly.
make it into something new and better than it was before. I feel like that would be true iconoclasm.
Yeah, yeah. I think it has a big parallel with interpersonal relationships. I mean, I guess it's kind of like, there's a bad marriage and the husband's thinking dogmatically in one way and the wife
Mhm.
is thinking dogmatically in the other way. And the iconoclast, the right place of the iconoclast is being the marriage counselor in the middle and being like, maybe we can like, or like, I don't know, two siblings who absolutely hate each other at each other's throats, sort of thing. And well, it's like, well, maybe we do this thing first and then we can do someone else's thing, that sort of stuff. But and I don't know. I think that human relationships are a microcosm for the larger things that go on in the world.
Mhm.
Um, I think this is particularly because of the two-party system, but I think that United States is like particularly analogous to a bad marriage right now, like specifically like analogous to a bad marriage. And one side, maybe this is a bit sexist of me, basically, but I think you know the the progressive side is too feminine. It's too kumbaya and liberal and thinking that we can ignore the real tangible problems that are going on
Mhm.
and carry on the way things were. And then the I guess the more Republican side, although I don't know how much control the Republicans really have of whatever's going on in that movement anymore. But it's very masculine. It's very let's
Mhm.
control the household. Let's put things back in order. Let's do some work. Let's do all this sort of stuff. Let's protect our own. It's very interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going to happen there, but I think my ideas in the book are apt, and this is kind of one of my points in the book is that philosophy is the meta question.
Mhm.
I realize this is that there can be a philosophy of anything. Like there's a philosophy of American politics, there's a philosophy of politics, there's a philosophy of religion, and these are all sub questions within the meta question that is philosophy. There
Mhm.
isn't the politics of philosophy. That doesn't make any sense. But there is a philosophy of politics, um, and that's one of the things. Again, it's kind of iconoclastic in the sense where I'm like, well, it can apply to everything, But I do think that's a sense in which my book is very useful for lots of different reasons. Is because it applies to lots of different fields of inquiry. I mean, I've applied these mental models to what I'm doing for my career, for example. I've applied these mental models to my interpersonal relationships, and I think they've worked pretty well. I don't know so far, but yeah, I'm kind of I'm interested what you think about my theory about the meta question, and I guess it really does kind of relates to Hume, as Hume said that philosophy was the queen of the sciences, and I think he was
Mhm.
trying to say that in terms of bigging up philosophy. I almost say it's the meta question in kind of a negative way. Because it's all encompassing, but it's not specific. I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
I think that. the only way we could, I don't want to say the word answer because I don't think the meta question is something that can be answered, but I think
Good.
the
You
only
read the book.
way I think the only way we can experience it is
Yes.
through irrationality.
Hmm.
Is I remember I was talking to and Javier Rivera
Mm.
trying to explain what I thought of this book. And he said back to me, he said, I think what you're trying to explain is that to experience this is we have to go into a place where knowledge limits and logic won't work here. And I was like, ah, that's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so I think we need to go into that place, but again, I think that we need to come back and collect. It's almost like kind of going into a void and seeing something, but you don't know what you've seen until you're out of the void.
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense. It's almost like how an artist paints or sings or
Precisely.
how a writer writes something. It's like you start writing something and you kind of go into this forgetfulness and you go into this void where you anything's up for grabs.
Yeah.
And then you see something, a glimpse of something, and then you've brought it back with you, but you don't know what you've brought back until you're done writing what you just wrote.
Yeah. No, that's right on the point. And I think that a lot of my work, not just this, but a lot of my work is very anti-philosophical in the sense that it's very against the idea of not just philosophy, but all kind of lanes of intellectual inquiry as they're often seen, especially by academics, as abstract things, like philosophy
Mhm.
and the abstract and these sorts of things, which is a useful tool to get into the logic of things, I think.
Mhm.
But lots of my work, I would say all of my work actually, comes from what I call the embodied context. It comes from the context that we are stuck with, and this is very much kind of I kind of thought about this before reading Schopenhauer, then realizing that he was way ahead of me on this one. But yeah, it all kind of comes from an embodied context, which is the fact that we as philosophical subjects are trapped within. I say that in a bad and a good way. The human body, like we're trapped within our biological substrate, and frankly, the human animal. I mean, anyone who's lived any time on the planet Earth will know this, that we're not primarily logical and abstract beings. We're primarily irrational and physical beings. Um, and this is why it's a question against academic philosophy, which is the abstract philosophy, this kind of ideal of intellectualism that we can aspire to, when in fact, I think a lot of philosophy actually doesn't reflect abstract truths. It actually reflects the personality of the person who's written or thunk it.
Mhm.
um, and that's it, frankly. Like all the beautiful things that humanity's created they're only beautiful by virtue of our irrationality. There's nothing rationally perfect about the Sistine Chapel. In fact, if you look at it as from a material, like a dogmatically materialist context, it's a bunch of stone piled on top of each other and various dyes splattered on a wall. Like
Mhm.
it's not a beautiful arrangement of matter. But if you're there viewing it from the fallible eyes of a human subject, then it's a beautiful thing. And it comes back to what you were saying. Like the artist is an artist because of the embodied context, the irrationality of the embodied context, by virtue of the fact that he has a body to paint with. And like you said, it's the same for the writer. It's the same for the musician. Um, and I think that kind of alludes to the fact that humanity's highest achievements are going to be irrational, iconoclastic things. But we have the capacity for abstract, dogmatic thought as well, which is something I mentioned in the book, which is things like the Large Hadron Collider. That's a cathedral to science in a way. Um, so yeah, I hope that makes sense. But that's my thoughts on that, at least.
No, absolutely. And I also agree. I think life actually unfolds in a very irrational way. I'll use another story example. It's kind of like you call your friend to meet somewhere and you go to the restaurant where you're supposed to meet and your friend's not there because all of a sudden they like just forgot. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They just forgot about it. And you don't see your friend, but you see somebody else there that you haven't seen in a long time. And so you decide to sit with them and you talk for 2 hours. And what happened there wasn't logical. It
No.
was it wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And there's a certain beauty in that because it's almost like being surprised over and over again and over again.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, life is a series of surprises. But coming back to how this book is actually, in a sense, kind of practically useful is, um, for many years, I was kind of like a stickler for time, and I'd get really annoyed if a friend of mine was late or something because I was like, this is disrespectful to my time and all this sort of stuff. But, having the ability, like an extra 15 minutes to sit and read or something, I don't know, maybe that's an opportunity. Different ways of thinking about it. But yeah, it can help you get over some of your own neuroses, I think, these ways of thinking.
Mhm.
Which, if you don't want to approach this book on an abstract scholarly level, you can at least approach it on a practical level, and I think you might get something from it, especially the early chapters,
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the most glimpses I got was from or were from the earlier chapters where I was like, oh my gosh, I do that. Oh my gosh, this is my life. And
Mm.
and so I'm super thankful for your book and everything you said. I'm and that's why I wanted to promote your book too, because I feel like it could help a lot of people kind of break out of that dogmatic way of thinking because I know it's really helped me to feel a little lighter in certain areas of my life because philosophy it kind of has the stigma of being very like depressive and
Yeah,
and sad
yeah.
and like just very overall negative is
Mhm.
like when you're studying philosophy you're going through an existential crisis but this book for me was very joyful if I could use
It
words.
is, yeah. This is the thing is, I think I'm quite a pessimistic person in general, but I think it's quite a playful book, which separates it from a lot of philosophy as well. I think philosophy has that reputation for a good reason. I mean, again, maybe back to a bit of sexism here, but philosophy mostly attracts guys, and they're the sort of guys who they find a philosophy book they like, and they base their whole personality around that book or that philosopher, and it makes them, I don't know, man. Philosophers are incredibly insufferable people. I wouldn't want to be around them.
I wouldn't say that. I know a lot of wonderful philosophers.
And I want people who are very like somewhat. If you're out there and you've based your entire personality around a philosopher or a philosophical idea or a book, I would like you to read this book. Or if you're an academic as well, those are the people I'd really like to read this book. They won't read it, they won't appreciate it, but I'd like them to read it in an ideal world because there's a lot more. There's a lot more to life, guys.
Yes,
I feel like I was in
absolutely.
that space, and I feel like this book was almost me saving myself in a way. I mean, I'm not saying I'm complete. I'm not saying I'm not insufferable now. I'm saying maybe I'm slightly less insufferable.
I know. But no, I don't
Maybe
think you're
slightly less.
insufferable at all. No, it's funny because my I have like philosophy friends who are very much in that like
Mm,
the moodiness of
yes.
philosophy. And
Yes.
I'll like send little gifs of like sunshine and rainbows and they're like, "How are you like this? You read Schopenhauer." I'm like, because I read the Iconoclast.
Yes, exactly. The antidote to the angst,
Yes.
perhaps.
Well, thank you so much for being on my channel and talking about your book. I really, really appreciate it.
This was great. I'm glad it's been a couple of years now. I'm glad people are still, coming back to it or reading it. And um, yeah, both here and in our, conversations, it's really, really good to have your thoughts on it. And I think I mentioned this to you. I've said this to other people as well, that most people who read it kind of get something out of it that I didn't intend, which I think is really beautiful. And I think that's very iconoclastic as well. Like it's not just everyone's got my dogmatic prescriptions for what philosophy is or what they should do. That played jazz with it, which I think is really nice. And yeah, I think again, to extend on that point, I think most people who've read it have understood it better than I did when I was writing it, which I think it just came from me in an impulse. I don't think I even really wrote it. I think something from the beyond probably penned it, but yeah, I've really enjoyed your reflections on it. It's been really nice to talk about it again and talk with you.